about 4 years ago, just outside, because you've been to Washington, and probably people have been to Washington, outside the Capitol, going down the steps. On the right side, there is a Canadian embassy, and immediately after Canadian embassy, literally, there is what is called a newseum. Newseum, which is a museum of news, was emerged about 4 years ago, which is one of the precursor of what is happening today, meaning that the media in United States, they tried to get some understanding about where they come from, how did they become so important. And it's not a normal museum. It's actually about the country itself, it's the history itself, as the news and the communications have intervened at various points of time, and not only in US, but also global. It's a very worthwhile innovation that could be planted in each and every country, a museum which keeps tracks of what is happening. And one other thing that they do, which is quite incredible, is that every morning, they have so many states in the United States. Every morning, the front pages of newspapers, yeah? There is a wall outside. When you go in, you come down from the Capitol, you go to the Capitol, the same news and probably the same tweet that we know from whom is appearing and is interpreted in different ways, 50 times different, on the front page of each of the state in major newspapers. And you get a feel for the overall. That's exactly the man who came here. We talked about media, Andrew, yeah, ex-BBC. So there is a very important contribution that the media can make if you take it in a holistic way. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. No. So, Keith, would you want to elaborate on this limits to media or limitless?
Yes, I think I'd want to make
as a signal of tomorrow.
Yep,
yeah.
Okay, just make 4 points about the future of the media. One is that we are moving from broadcasting to narrowcasting.
Yeah.
So in broadcasting, it is a small number of stations transmitting to a large number of people. Whereas we are moving now to a large number of stations transmitting to a small number of people. So if somebody tells me what radio station they listen to, I know a lot about them. So we are tailoring the broadcasts down to narrowcast. So we're creating a series of micro audiences rather than a national audience. There are now very few national events outside of sport, and perhaps national tragedies such as the death of Princess Diana.
And weather.
Secondly, we now have the information technology revolution and the rise of social media and the rise of YouTube. Every hour, 7,000 hours of video gets uploaded to YouTube. So every hour, 7,000 hours gets uploaded. So if you were to watch YouTube between now and the time you die, you'll never be able to watch everything that's on YouTube. And people are now able to broadcast their own news. So I see people with their own telephones, which are now small TV cameras, are broadcasting directly through the net, or indeed broadcasting their own meals and taking photos, etc. The third development is been hinted at already by Mihaela, is the end of the newspaper. So we see newspapers now, to a certain extent, if they're surviving, are now being reinvented, but with much smaller circulations. And the rise, of course, of fake news. Now, fake news is not new. We've had fake news for hundreds of years. As long as we've had propaganda, we've had fake news. The problem now is that we are living in a world of multiple realities, and it's very difficult to work out exactly what constitutes the truth. In broadcasting terms, we see this with climate change. I show my class of Boston University students a segment from a late night comedy program, John Oliver, explaining the climate change debate. So if you ask Americans, or for that matter Australians, about climate change, they will say, oh, well, the science is still not agreed because you've still got competing points of view. John Oliver has said the problem is that the role of the media is not to tell the truth, it is to provide a balance. So when it comes to climate change in the United States, you've always got Bill Nye, the science guy, on one side saying, yes, there is a problem with climate change, and you always have a climate change denier. So a person at home watching that program would think, oh, well, the scientists are divided. You've got Bill Nye and one other climate denier. John Oliver, on that segment, said we will now have a statistically appropriate debate on climate change. So along with, of course, Bill Nye, the science guy, you've also got a climate change denier. Then two other climate change deniers are brought on, because only 3% of scientists deny climate change. And then another 96 scientists are brought on in their white coats to stand alongside Bill Nye, the science guy, because that shows the real debate that is taking place. 97% of scientists agree that there is a problem with human-induced climate change. But the way the media portray it is that we provide a balance. So it ends up there with people at home being confused. So summarizing so far, one is the rise of narrowcasting as distinct from broadcasting. Secondly, the information technology revolution, whereby people can now broadcast their own news, and they can do that on a variety of outlets. And then thirdly, the end of the newspaper as a balanced source of trying to provide information. My final point is that all these changes coming together are creating what is now being called the Narcissist society. From Narcissus in, I think, Greek mythology, the person who looked at himself in the pool of water and then fell in love with that pool of water, fell in and drowned. And the argument that we have been involved with is that we are becoming self-obsessed, narrow-minded. We are confronted with a world of threats. The Club of Rome, which Mihaela and I are both members, have been warning about these problems since at least 1972 and our report on limits to growth. But in fact, the audience that we need to try to communicate with, the audience is obsessed with narrow stuff, immediate stuff. Its immediate interest has no long-term view of the future. And so we are going to be blindsided by change. And as T.S. Eliot, the Anglo-American poet, said, humanity can only stand a little reality. So our societies today are fragile. We lack resilience. We see this in the so-called war on terror. We're easily panicked, very different from the people who were in this country 70 years ago who had withstood the Great Depression and World War II. Now it's a bunch of wimps, easily spooked by threats of terrorism. I know that. Terrorism has made me rich. Thanks to terrorism, I have become, in the media, we make a lot of money out of terrorism. But in fact, the average American stands a greater chance of dying through food poisoning than from terrorism. And so, or for guns, yes. but only if the gun, you only get published in the US if the guns are used by a Muslim. If it's a white Christian militia and they go into court saying, "Hail Hitler," no publicity. So the Americans have over-exaggerated the threat of Islamicist terrorism. But people are vulnerable. They feel vulnerable. They lack resilience. In fact, this is the safest time to be alive that we've had for centuries. The most dangerous time between 1900 and today to be alive was between 1900 and 1950, which is the outbreak of the Korean War. Since 1950, we've had a reduction of the total number of wars, reduction of the total number of people killed in those wars. The world is getting safer, more integrated. Trade is knitting the world together. The world is becoming safer. The tragedy, though, is our media are making people very vulnerable, self-absorbed, self-indulgent, and so fragile. And they are missing the really big changes. There are great opportunities, but there are also great threats. And we're not able to focus on that in the media. In Australia, for example, the 20 most popular programs, 17 are on sport, 3 are on cooking. My current affairs programs don't get a look in. That's the challenge that we have got. I'll leave it at that point, Mihaela.
So, conclusion is that we're all going to drown.
Well, if you're in the Seychelles, my friend, you're gone. That's right. If you're in the Seychelles, you are going to go underwater.
We do have.
You're going to get a reply
have
from the
you been to
BBC.
Have you been to Seychelles?
No.
We have mountains.
Oh, you have that? All right.
We're
No,
not
we
just
all
coral-
go to
coral-
Lesotho.
coral that.
Mountains in Lesotho.
Thank you, Keith.
We will all go to Lesotho.
But if we're becoming narcissistic, we're all going to wash ourselves in the water.
All right.
That's what I meant.
Thank you, Keith. This is one of those contributions where you say, follow that, mate. Well, I can reassure you, as regards climate change, that the BBC issued an apology recently for an incorrectly balanced item, which actually had, it had the famous two people that you talk about, but it was recognized they shouldn't have had the famous two people, because as you say, 97, I've heard the figure of 98.5% of experts on climate change agree it is a real thing. And this makes another point. They had someone talking about climate change who was either a BBC environment correspondent or someone else. And they then, in quotes, balanced, very heavy quotes, this, with Nigel Lawson, the British highly Brexitovian Chancellor of the Exchequer who lives in France. This was an example not just of, I was myself involved 25 years ago.
There you are.
What's that?
BBC.
It's the BBC. 25 years ago, in dealing with this matter of balance is not just, as one Director General said, a question of having a spoonful of sugar and a spoonful of salt and saying those balance out. Those balance into nonsense. And actually, the Nigel Lawson thing makes another point about celebritism. You know, if he was just another person who had an eccentric view about climate change, one of the 1.5 or 2% who don't agree, then no one would have bothered. But because it was Nigel Lawson, it mattered. The former, the Chancellor being the number 2 person in the British government. Not only did it matter, but it was a production error. And here I would criticize BBC colleagues in thinking that because he was famous, somehow he was an expert on everything. And he's not. And he is an illogical enough man, as Omar was laughing, that actually, you know, he's a strong Brexiteer, but he loves France, so he lives there, right? Because it's good for his tax situation. The former Director General of the BBC, Mark Thompson, has written an excellent book. I don't say it because he is a mate of mine. He's one of the many people, I'm one of the many people who can say, he was one of my staff at one time. He's now managing editor of that terrible organ, the New York Times. But he's written a book called Enough Said. And the book is fascinating because it talks about the fact that the way the media projects things now is governed by political events and the media's own attitude. Political events, he makes the argument that the referendum, as opposed to the general election campaign, the single question, is not a good way of conducting political debate. And I don't just say that because the British referendum came out with a disastrous outcome, in my view. He just says that actually program makers' minds are not set to focus on one question. They're better suited to sorting out a complex range of issues as previously existed in election campaigns with political parties having programs. The other point he makes is that the mere grammar of new media, 140 whatever it is, characters for Twitter, actually is counterproductive in terms of the nature of communication. And this is an advantage if you're Donald Trump, because he deliberately manages to overcome the problem of his relative illiteracy by making an advantage out of Twitter. And this is very clever. So before anyone can get at a serious piece of commentary on the small number of news and information outlets that do exist, he, in the middle of the night, has preempted them, and thus he has changed the news agenda. Because the mere fact that not only Donald Trump, but the President of the United States, the most powerful country in the world, can say that, changes the news agenda. Because as news people, we are indicated to follow the important events and the important people. Then I'd like to pick up a point that was made yesterday. I can't catch
In
up.
fact, he
You know.
sets the agenda.
It's my short legs.
Andrew,
Sorry.
he sets the agenda.
He sets the agenda. Now, yesterday, Carl Miller, I thought was actually brilliant, said something extremely important. He pointed out how easy it is to make an impact with almost no effort. And in describing that case of the police going into a cybercrime situation in London, he said that the people who were there were not hardened criminals. They weren't even people who said, "Hey, Gov, what are you talking about?" Nor did they pull a gun. They were actually like schoolboys. But through a small amount of investment, they are able to make a huge impact on the way society is run. And I thought the frightening point that he made was that actually governments like those of Mr. Putin and Mr. Xi Jinping are far better suited to resist these things because they can control the internet, or they've got societies which control the internet. So unless we get our act together, we're going to be in very bad shape. While I'm at it, can I make a point that I think was a tribute to Mihaela, as I came out of yesterday's discussions, the ones that I was at. Omar made, as he always does, something very sensible, but he said the trust word came out of yesterday's presentations from the panel. I'd like to, in that same area, add another thought, but it's very much a complementary thought. The words are getting a fair deal. Because our various experts yesterday, so Alan and Donald and all the others and Amitav, were talking about the way in which in their respective areas people make investments. And they make investments in expecting to get certain outcomes. One of the things that actually Smart Partnership is about is trying to ensure that the environment in which we work is one in which you get a fair return for your investment. And again, Carl made the point that actually for only a very small amount of investment, certain people can get a huge return. Someone made the point, I think it was Donald, about Nigeria, that for a small amount of effort, a small number of people were taking the money that is owed to large numbers of other people who are disadvantaged. Someone is disadvantaged here.
Somebody wants to speak. We don't have any.
It could be, there is live broadcasted, and there are people who are watching.
That sounds like a phone line that's been left on. Yeah, yeah, and it was. So this is a very important part. In Smart Partnership, we go back always to these principles of fairness. And just to relate what I was saying a moment ago to the principle of fairness, we talk a lot about national visions. There's a big question around whether the national vision is the most important vision. There's been a book written by a man called David Goodhart. I don't know where you've seen it. Have you seen it, Mihaela, called The Road to Somewhere?
Yeah.
And the road to somewhere. And it's about the idea that populism, European populism, populism in America or anywhere, is based on a feeling that the national identity has got lost. This was behind Brexit and so on. So quite separately from all the things which corrupt media might seek to play on, there's a question of how the road to somewhere compares with the road to anywhere, which is a thing which is saying humanity is more important than any particular national identity. And I was just asking the question, as smart partners, where do we stand on the road to somewhere, which is the title of this book, and the road to anywhere, which is mentioned in the book, and as an example of something else. And I would like to say that actually my own instinct is that we are somewhere between, but I personally feel closer to the road to anywhere, which is why when Mrs. May, Freudian slip, when Mrs. May said there are people around who are citizens of nowhere, I found that quite an offensive statement, because it implied that often through bad luck they ended up in a situation without citizenship because they might be refugees or something, which the way she put it was a slur on those people's humanity. And I know from my own history and where my father was, as a Jewish person in Central Europe and then coming to Britain, but not a practicing Jew, only a person of Jewish origin racially, not a practicing Jew. Hitler made speeches where he said, there are those people who are in Paris one moment and then Berlin the next. Most of us smart partners will be in trouble for this. And then in Berlin the next, and then maybe somewhere in Asia the next, and then in America, and they don't belong anywhere. Now the idea that because you travel, you have no sense of moral identity or anchoring, is quite obscene. So on this spectrum between, and I mentioned it because of national visions, between the road to somewhere and the road to anywhere, I personally feel myself tending towards the road to anywhere. Just a thought. But I've moved somewhere. Yeah. Yeah.
For humanity. What is the name of the author? Michael?
Sorry, David Goodhart. David Goodhart.
Yeah, I just want to, to chip in that. This media issue, especially looking into the new media, is there a possibility of a traditional media claiming control again over new media? Because the way things are, you happen to find that, anybody can tweet anything. The media, has to either certify that or say something opposite to that. But you happen to find that the new media, the social media, is actually setting the trend, the agenda, as opposed to what the media used to do, the traditional media used to do. So are we in a situation whereby we are saying, I'll go back to what you just said, going anywhere, because anybody can tweet anything and then feed us any information right at the spot, and then the traditional media needs to come hours or minutes later to try to correct the whole thing that has already gone viral. So, I just want to figure out, have we reached a dead end? We have about anything can go anywhere, because, I don't know who is in control now. Yes.
Yes, indeed. I'm very pessimistic about the future of traditional media because, in a sense, it's all media in a free society. So that's the Western world and many of the countries represented here. All those media are determined upon consumers. It's the people who consume the media. I notice this in the way that the BBC, which is always seen as the hallmark of public broadcasting, is going down market, because the viewers and listeners are themselves now much more down market. They don't want Shakespeare and ballet, and they don't want opera. And the news programs have to be brought in with far more colour and verve. So the language of sport has entered politics, and the language of war has entered sport. And so what we see now is media outlets competing for the attention. We're living in the attention economy. And so that means that you are forever focused on how you're going to get the viewers. And that means traditional media are far too hidebound, too respectable, too conservative. And so it's like, as Andrew has just said, President Trump using Twitter can therefore communicate with people. And people like to get their news in 140 characters. I don't. I'm quite often broadcasting with people, particularly during a major crisis, who are working off Twitter. And you simply cannot get the full picture from 140 characters. So my job, and that, again, that's why I say terrorism has made me rich, because I'm in the studio giving them the big picture. But my colleagues are trying to get instant coverage off Twitter and getting a very distorted coverage. But I'm very pessimistic, sir, about the future of traditional media. We on Channel 7, one of the commercial stations, we have declining viewer figures. BBC, ABC, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation are also in that business. The only countries that really can control this, has been suggested by Andrew, would be the more dictatorial ones like China and the People's Republic of China, People's Republic of China and Russia, because they can control the media. The problem is, with their media, is they're often publicising lies anyway. You're still not getting the truth. You're just getting the government point of view, which may not be accurate anyway. So we're living in an era when people should be better informed, should be much more discerning as media consumers. But in fact, people are becoming more and more superficial, because particularly with young people, they are click and flick. They don't read books. They don't read long articles. They're just going from one sensation to the next. And so we're dumbing down an entire generation of people. It is very frightening as to where we're likely to be in 20 years' time.
I would take a position a little less pessimistic than Keith, and not just to defend the BBC. I mean, the BBC's figures are still very strong on its main channels, and I would say that's not just because there has been some dumbing down. I think they're still strong, and I'm more optimistic. The thing which frightens me most is what we heard from Carl yesterday, the capacity of people with very little effort and very little skill and very little money to interfere with new media in a way which they couldn't with the old media. You know, I mean, we were constantly, and before I worked in the World Service, I was involved as a kind of gopher, kick-around gopher, for the top guy in News and Current Affairs, and I drafted the first Current Affairs news guidelines, although he signed them. but the fact is that we were constantly receiving complaints, and half of them were related to the Israeli-Arab situation. We were constantly receiving complaints that X-editor was biased. And the way that the BBC editorial process works, and this is, I'm sure Keith will agree with this is the absolute polar opposite of how new media works and how Donald Trump works, was there were many opinions fed in, and it was extremely difficult for one person to influence a news program. This was not like how, you know, Simon, what's his name, runs the X Factor or whatever, and he actually can sit there and dominate it. But the BBC editorial process was, and I believe still is, highly complex. So you can't get at someone in that way. And this is another contrast, of course, with the way new media works, that you just wake up in the middle of the night and tweet your view. So I would be a little bit more, I think, a little to significantly more optimistic, but I wouldn't in any way, I wouldn't be stupid enough to underrate what Keith says, because he knows a lot about it. And he's made money out of the new system. So
I'd just like to go on just from what Keith has just said. Yeah, Australian again. Yeah. But I mean, I have 3 children who are now in their late 20s, early 30s. I've got 4 grandchildren, and I'm really, and I've got an ex-wife. But the only person in the whole location who reads the newspaper is me. My children, when I go to see them with the grandchildren, are not watching any news outlet at all. My daughter, who's an accountant, doesn't read the media whatsoever. She's on her laptop looking at it online, whatever she's looking at online. And I consider them to be intelligent people, but they've really switched off the news. So really, and when I go down there and I give them articles and items about their careers, they say, "Thanks, Dad," and then go on with their normal lives. They don't really know what's going on in the world. So it's a first world problem, but to me it's generational. Anybody above 40 reads newspapers, maybe, or anybody above 50 or 60 or 90 reads newspapers. But anybody below that age doesn't buy them anymore. And I'm thinking about getting a digital newspaper because I'm worried about going down the street and buying a newspaper as being one of these people that are going to be ostracised in the future for buying a newspaper.
My son-in-law is an MP at the Parliament in Cyprus, and he doesn't buy newspaper. He borrows mine occasionally.
Now, to add to the gloom, of what said, there is the other part. I was looking at something that said the end of death, because of all the new development in biology, particularly the new groups of technologies called the omics, right? The genomics, the proteomics, whatever it is. So the end of death. On the other hand, the end of work, because we're all going to be replaced by robots. So what is then going to happen? That's to add to the gloom anyway, so something to think about.
Mexico is thinking about all this. You're always very optimistic. You always were.
Doctor, now I was dosing, listening carefully. I was dosing, listening carefully. And you see, the road to nowhere. You see, smart partners, I believe that there is a solution to everything. The principle of smart partnership is that we get better ways to overcome problems, to make sure that the environment offers us equal opportunities both to live and to end. I think, I don't know whether this is really the first serious humanity threatening, serious problems threatening humanity since the beginning of life. There have been many, many, many serious problems, but I think the wisdom that the Almighty have embedded or entrusted to humanity will emerge for us to become victorious over things that we think that will be the end of our existence. And of course, Mikhail, I am always optimistic because the reason why I enjoy attending these debates is because I learn how to devise solutions to problems, specifically at home. As one of the smart partners said, in your own family and beyond your nuclear family. I think we will overcome that. What is important really is to do what we are doing. We must interact continuously. We must share information, but at the same time, be able to share this information with others. And in the end, I believe that a solution will come out. In as far as governments are concerned, I just wanted to pick up something that we have mentioned here. And I believe that it will strengthen us in knowing exactly where we are heading to in terms of the technology growth, which have got both positive influence and effect on our lives and quite negative effects on effects on our lives. Now, somebody said that they repeated what was said yesterday, that the more conservative, in some of our opinions, governments, and the more strict governments may have more capacity to resist and monitor, the negative effects on in their nationals and in their countries. And examples were given, Russia and China. You see, maybe this is also a lesson that tells us that sometimes we do judge things without a thorough study and understanding why certain things are happening. Maybe this is the time for us to realize that what we have called, what's it in politics? Freedom of information and oppressive governments in terms of totalitarian governments. You see, maybe there is a reason. There is time when you have to be a little bit stricter than believing you are different from others and you are going to open up everything. Now, yesterday, people, smart partners were saying, you know, we are just looking on and governments cannot control the situation. Yesterday I felt hopeless. I thought there's nothing we can do. Why are we talking about something that we cannot do anything about? So we cannot get a solution. But the light is coming and saying, look, there is a way that you can overcome that. And we should look at those possibilities and systems that apparently in the short term we thought they are dictators, but in the long term they are emerging to be having some control mechanisms to make sure the effect of digital scaping or whatever it is maybe applied in a more positive way. So, Michaela, I was struck by the Cameroon example, and the explanation there brought me to the realization that almost 90% of our countries, whether it is developing or developed, have got that illness. And that is the illness of the lack of what I will term for lack of good words, lack of awareness on collective dependence, interconnected connection. So in government, most of our governments, when you are in foreign affairs, you deal with foreign affairs, you don't care with many of the other things that is happening in government. That interdependence awareness, that what I do have got an impact on the others, is not really there. And it have, of course, in many cases, is going to impact on us unless we have got that interconnected dependency in governments in what we do. And that is why I like this. If all our governments and private sector can know that whatever I do, it is dependent on what the other people are doing in other sectors. You see, when you go in certain countries and you talk about a Minister of Foreign Affairs about statistics, or you talk about data and other things, standard and so on, they simply don't care. Their line is straight to international relations. There it ends. But if you ask them, do you have standard in your country? They may not know. That as smart partners now through our hubs, maybe this is an opportunity we have to realize to make sure that in whatever we are doing, whether it is private sector, government, and intergovernmental interconnection on activities and sharing of information, applies in all activities that we do. Maybe that will help us. That will help us. And the interconnectivity in Smart Partner basically will help us to do that. I wanted just to mention that, you know, Cameroon is not the only country that have got that. And that is why we have a problem with our visions. Because the visions, some says they should not have a deadline. Some says they should, after this one will come. You know, in the developing country, what we believe that when we come to the level of London the standard of living of London, we have achieved everything, you know. So we, in many of the visions, you will see that there is an intention of reaching the level of developed countries. Now, in what way, I don't know, because in London I still see some people sleeping on the pavement there. Now, what do we want to what do we want to inspire to in terms of reaching the level of living in London? I don't see it in my country. It's rare in Windhoek to get somebody sleeping there. You will get somebody begging during the day, but when it is night, and I'm sure also in yours, but we want to reach your level. But we have never defined what level in your lifestyle do we want to reach. So these are some of the questions that we have to answer, but answer them smartly, discuss them smartly, because it will be easily construed as if you are prescribing to those who are leading certain institutions. But of course, it is important for us to be clear when we are implementing our visions and so on, and that they are continuously implemented. That's why I asked Cameroon, what happened? What happened? That's why I asked that question, because I know sometimes the style of leading countries differs. When this one comes, you put this one aside. When the other one comes, they put. And therefore, the vision is on and off and on and off. And you don't achieve what you want to achieve. Michaela, thank you very much. But this is very interesting. And thank you very much for the media. For the media. I hope it is also good that they die and reborn.
One thing that kind of we intended to do this time is to take forward not just what we call now digital landscape and the distributed growth or distributed wealth and so on, but actually to kind of balance what Keith was and Andrew bringing to us is how to survive a networked age. Because it's not a question that we are all kind of now pessimistic and so on, and there are limits to what we can do. I know that the Club of Rome, when first time became Club of Rome, was referred as Club of Rome, and they raised the issue of limits to growth. That was exactly the same kind of feel that, but the intention was not to say we are doomed. There are limits to growth, and here is even best modeling and so on to demonstrate to you that unless population is capped and unless this and that, the economic growth stops. The intention was to attract the attention that there has to be a way forward found. And yes, there were cycles and so on, and here we are again, climate change is becoming one of the major preoccupation of each and every global citizen. So there is a question of how to survive, how to take forward the networks and the adaptive networks. And the smart partnership idea that came out, not just an ideology, is probably a way forward. Now, there are many historians and others that are kind of preoccupied with that and try to express in foreign affairs, in kind of think tanks, Chatham House, Brooklyn, whatever, wherever it is, Club of Rome. There is one that which attracted our attention, Neil Ferguson, that usually he's not known for being preoccupied with network theory and so on. He's very pragmatic. But he felt a need for actually putting together something in about 3 months' time. It's so current, this book, which is quite big. I don't know how you've done it. It's a real time, more or less, writing a book. And why did he do that? Because whatever he put together, in about a week time, he says, it was already not past, but new ideas by the way of how to survive network age appeared. And because of that, he said, well, are there really, is there really a doom? Isn't it a false prophecy of this hyperconnection? And I think it'll be very, very useful, not just to read the book, because we are going to send around clippings of it, but just to reflect on some insights he put in. And I just pick up 3 insights. He said that, you know, what one notices in the networks nowadays is that weak ties are becoming strong. They're actually strong. And one shouldn't just emphasize and focus on strong ties, which we perceive they are strong ties, but the weak ties are actually strong because of these networks and data and so on. Also, he's saying that one doesn't, when you look at government structures and formal structure and so on, you know, there is a cycle of a day and night and work and so on. But networks never sleep. That is reflected in media, is reflected in many other things. And another one was that, which is quite obvious maybe, but that the network. So once a network appeared, they actually network within the network. So the networks network themselves. They are not structures that are there. Yeah? And the major probably insight that he brought in is that the next few years, the inequality of networks is a new, different type of inequality that is probably the major problem. And is inequality within countries, within institutions, within families. Inequality of networks is probably a focus, a major focus that needs to be brought in. So it's not just promote networks, promote data technologies to promote networks. It's actually what is emerging from that, which is more important. The inequality of networks and inequality of people. Yeah. So, well, I suppose I only would like to say that the wisdom, and Omar, you will have this time the last word. The smart partners, I said here, did prove again that we accrued a body of wisdom and experience, rule of thumb, proverb, strategic concept, judgment, and intuition, which is quite unrivaled. Now, is it that we are going to write a book about it? Or how is it that we are going to spread and communicate and evolve? I don't think we should write a book. We have a manifesto, Limitless. I think we are pushing the limits, probably. We should push the limits beyond the current because of the network age. And we are very, very happy to say that Tsolo became part of our smart partnership movement if he wasn't before. So I'd like you to share with the governor of the bank, which probably will be even better equipped than herself, the notion of cryptocurrency, the future of the money. And by the way, the reason why this is very readable, better than any other kind of things that the governor of the bank is reading or is given by World Bank and whoever, is because it's written by a journalist who wanted to actually understand himself. And you will see most of the digital companies and so on, they are recommending this rather than any other book about cryptocurrency. It's the future of money. So please. There is another one, but I won't give it to anybody. I haven't yet read it, and I may be presumptuous, but to kind of recommend it to anybody is about Life 3.0. But ending up with Life 3.0, it means that there is a future, And thank you very much for those who are, that we are not doomed. There may be a machine intelligence interface future, but there will still be a need for a smart partnership and CPTM itself. So, Omar, please.
I just want to respond to Mr. concern about vision and how do you compare what is that you want to achieve. So just to go back to Vision 2020 of Malaysia, when Dr. Mahathir said we want to be a developed nation by the year 2020, he qualified that by saying to be a developed nation in our own mold. So you define that where you want to be. Now, picking up from Andrew, again, I keep referring to this lecture that I went to, which I thought is very, very interesting. After, this guy has just written a book which is yet to be released called Open Source Leadership. And he came up with all kinds of ideas. When we talk about leadership, are we really talking about leadership or followership, for example? So this kind of a thing that he has came around. And then after saying all that, he came to the conclusion that we do need what he called a positive autocratic leader. And how do you how do you define or what qualifies you to be a positive autocratic leadership? You have to earn the right to use to be an autocratic leader. Be autocratic about values and purpose while remaining humble and compassionate with people. Next one was provide freedom with a framework. Listen, learn, reflect continuously, and forgive more often. So when the book is out, I recommend you get that. It's here. All the very nice thing, which was opposite to what was there? Richard was saying about people within the company. He says you don't own people, you outsource people. You don't need everybody in your company. So the idea about identifying a group as the future leader, that's all out of the thing now. You don't pick people and then you leave the others out. So that is a very, so I recommend that, and I thought just to reply to this. So let us all try to be a positive autocratic leader. I don't know whether we can do that. So thank you.
On behalf of my delegation and on behalf of the entire government of Lesotho and the Basotho at large, thank whoever invited us here. We have gathered information which is very, very, very essential, and we want to commit at this stage that we would advocate, we would use our leadership skills to advocate and disseminate the information we gathered here, so that at least we are on the same page, that this is the direction that the world would like to lead from now onwards. We really appreciate the fact that information should be leveraged into usable data, and we believe that that can bring about economic growth and change the lives of the people. I think I rest my case and thank everybody that we interacted with, and look forward to meet in April 2018 with our heads of state.
Maybe it is important that the very successful 2013 international dialogue in Dar es Salaam is reflected on, because in my view it have given a lot of information sharing, specifically on information technology growth. Yeah,